Welcome to the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast. Whether you are a seasoned professional or a first-time fundraiser, we have the advice you need to take your next step toward major gift mastery. I'm your host, Tom Dauber, President of Abundant Vision Philanthropic Consulting. Last week's conversation was a blast. I'm so excited to have you with me for this next segment. Let's get back to the show. One thing that I've run into, and I won't say where, but I've been at organizations where it's actually been a challenge sometimes to get the fiscal officers, and it might be because of those restrictions we talked about earlier. Sometimes it's hard to get money spent the way you'd want it to be. Have you seen that when you interact with any of your organizations? And if you have, what things are you able to do to help kind of free up that money and get it spent the way the donors want?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember I was on the board and treasurer of an organization, and someone had donated some restricted funds. I forget the exact amount. Let's call it $250,000, but it was only to be used on, I think, building improvements. It had been on the books for, I think, 10 to 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And so it just kept sitting around and sitting around and sitting around. And so, we just kind of kept, every time we would review the financial reports, we'd be like, and yeah, here's this line again, which we, until we finally sat down and said, how can we think about this strategically? Like maybe there's a way we can release these funds, or we can use it for a bigger, broader strategic initiative. But I think where it starts is really good reporting, which doesn't sound sexy, doesn't sound fun, but without a good CFO kind of person giving good reports and calling it out time and time again, it's easy to get lost in the shuffle of everything else going on. And so I think just having good reports and then having financial leadership who can call that out and say, hey, we're halfway through the year and we have maybe spent 10% of our marketing budget. There's an opportunity here. Maybe we can make some strategic investments. So to me, that's a great way to remedy that.
So in some organizations I've been in, it's really been accounting in the fiscal team that has been responsible for being focused on spending those restricted funds down. Other organizations I've been in, it's actually more driven by the development officer, going to the fiscal officer, pointing that out year after year, making those arguments. Do you have a preference on that? Do you feel like one way is better than the other?
So at least how I operate, I view the finance and accounting role as we just communicate to the rest of the organization who might be responsible who can better know how to spend those funds than we will. But we're there to communicate, and we're there to highlight and call out things. Everyone else in the organization is really busy, but if we can kind of highlight it and remind and call out, to me, that's where finance can be the most helpful.
That's great. Now tell me a little bit about GAAP, GAAP.
Yeah.
And where it runs afoul of campaign counting guidelines. I find that sometimes fiscal officers with accounting backgrounds can really get caught up there.
Yeah, and it's the rules we have to play by, unfortunately, when we go through audits and all that fun stuff. So let's walk through a couple examples. Kind of a high level, dollars secured today will most of the time are not going to equal dollars on the profit and loss statement. And so that creates just a lot of confusion out of the gate. It's like, well, I got this $250,000 pledge or this $250,000, grant. Why isn't it showing up on the financial statement yet? Things like a multi-year grant, let's say it's $750,000 over 3 years. Well, you're going to recognize that in chunks of 3. Conditional grants, let's say the funds are pledged, but until you hit a certain criteria, you can't necessarily recognize that. Even if you've received the money, you can't necessarily recognize that on the P&L if a certain condition in that grant has to be met. The thought process behind that is, if that condition isn't met, does that money then have to be given back, or is there a portion of that would have to go back? So that's why you don't recognize it right away. Another one that's honestly often missed is event sponsorships. So
Yeah.
let's say you've got your gala in the spring and you secure that donation in January. According to GAAP, you would recognize that in the month of the event because technically that sponsor, that event is going to have to happen for that donation to be satisfied, right? For the agreement to be satisfied. So you'd recognize it in the month that event happens. Another example is a pledge. If someone makes a pledge, that would be recognized right away, but there's something else going on in the finance brain with the pledge. It's, yeah, but I know there's a percentage likelihood that this isn't collected. And so the cash isn't in the door yet. And so we always keep that in mind, and it shows up on the financial statements as an accounts receivable, as something that's just, we don't have the cash yet, but yeah. So those are just a few examples.
Speaking of that, so I once heard that the default rate on a pledge is something like 10% or less. Do you have any insight into what that number is that's evidence-based?
Gosh, I don't. I really don't. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to stick with that number.
It seems reasonable, and I would imagine it can be across the board. I mean, I know I've worked at very small organizations where we'd only have a handful of pledges, and a lot of times they wouldn't come up. But part of that reason is because someone wasn't, those organizations in particular did not have a chief development officer or a sole development person. So there's a lot of value in that development role. And tracking that down and saying, remember, you made this promise to give. Just reminding you.
So there's a question I'd like to ask you. Mm-hmm. So this is the craziest thing that I ever heard from a fiscal person. Mm-hmm. There was a large piece of property donated, fire sale type of donation. So it was valued through appraisal officially, comps and everything. It was an 8-figure sort of piece of property. And they sold it to us for 7 figures. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, the accountant insisted that we could only value it as a gift at 7 figures. And the person's rationale was, well, what you sell something for is what it's worth. And so that's what you have to count it as in your campaign counting. Help me understand, because I never really, I mean, we got our way ultimately, but I was floored.
Yeah. And on that particular example, I would lean into a CPA for exact guidance on that specific example. But how I would think about it is there's a gain on that sale. So if the asset was worth a certain amount, but you were able to sell it above that amount, there's a gain component to that. You've made more money above that amount. Maybe the specifics of that required it by GAAP to be recognized at that. At the end of here's how I think about it. If at the end of the day the organization receives $1 million or $10,000 or $100,000 more of cash, to me that seems crazy to not count that towards a fundraising campaign, regardless of the accounting. If more cash has come into the organization, I don't see why that shouldn't count. That's my 2 cents on it.
Well, you're scoring points with me, Stephen. Let me tell you. Tom Dauber here for Abundant Vision Philanthropic Consulting. Fundraising can be hard work, and it can be hard to mentally get into the place you need to be in order to see new opportunities. Everyone struggles with it. We are like the fish in the fishbowl who just can't see the water they're swimming in. That's when having outside expertise comes in handy. For 25 years, I've been helping nonprofits analyze their challenges, discover new ways forward, and develop clear plans that lead to greater fundraising revenues. Now I am available to help your organization develop the abundant vision it needs to inspire new levels of philanthropy at your nonprofit as well. Check out abundantvision.net to start your journey toward greater fundraising success today. Now, back to the show. You wisely mentioned pledges.
Yeah.
And this one will probably, give you an upset stomach. What do you think about revocable deferred gifts, bequests, those sorts of things? How do you think about those as a CFO?
So, and I guess let's maybe use a specific example on this. Would this be something that, are you talking like referring to like writing in a will or?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's no necessarily strict dollar component on it, right?
There might be a percentage. There could be a
Yeah.
strict dollar, but it could be 20, 30 years. Could be
Yeah.
50 years, right?
That's one of the soft areas, and that's where it gets tricky. I mean, from an accounting perspective, that doesn't touch the books at all. From a development perspective, yeah, I guess it depends on the structure of the organization. Are they trying to incentivize long-term financial sustainability?
Hmm.
And if yes, then heck yeah, that's a huge, huge. I mean, that creates, you're making the development officer 20 years from now's job a heck of a lot easier, right? And so to me, that's a soft measure, but a critical measure for long term financial sustainability. But I guess it's a balance. I guess it depends on where the organization is at. If the organization is in a cash crunch and they need the money now, you might be like, yeah, that sounds great, but I need the dollars in the door.
Is there advice that you might have for fiscal officers in terms of what they should be keeping in mind about their fundraising team that might not be immediately obvious to them?
Yeah. I, my finance brain thinks about fundraising is how efficient or how inefficient did that dollar come in the door?
Hmm.
And so just thinking about it in terms of what are the hidden costs? So we know, for example, events, they take a lot of hidden staff time that might not be calculated in the true cost of that event, but there's a chunk of staff time that's dedicated to that. But it's rarely ever calculated in the net profit of an event. Same thing with grants, paying attention to what's that win rate on a grant, because you can sink a lot of time into grants and find you've only hit a very low percentage win rate. So just paying attention to the different avenues that money is fundraised in, and then how efficient or inefficient are each of those buckets, and are there opportunities to make that next dollar raised a little bit more efficient, because that just creates a financially sustainable organization in the long run.
Tell me more about that. So, how would I know as a CFO or a CDO if my cost to raise a dollar is where it ought to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd have to look up some benchmarks that are out there, and it's going to probably vary by different type of nonprofit, and especially will vary if you're raising grants versus an event. Where I honestly like to start is just within the organization. Hey, last year we raised, $100,000 from events, and our our hard costs were X, and we think we spent 200 staff hours at this rate on it. How are we looking for this year? And so just measuring, are we improving within the context of the organization? Are we getting more efficient or less efficient every year? That to me is a good place to start, an easy place to start.
That's a good way to think about it. My understanding is that across the industry, and I know it's going to vary between, you know, small nonprofits to universities and things, but the
Mm.
average is somewhere around 25% or 25 cents on the
Yeah,
dollar. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what the national average is. It matters how you're doing compared to what you did the year before, right?
that's right. That's right. And so to me, that's the win is I think you can have a benchmark in mind of like, we know we want to reach this goal eventually, but it might take years. It might take, and just even where the organization is at, it may just be at that stage. Might be tough to hit that metric, right? But if we're finding ways to improve that year over year, I mean, that's just that to me, that's a great way for us fiscal types and development officers to work together. That's a great analysis for the finance team to do for the development team, because the development team can take that back and say, hey, look, we're raising more money and we're doing it more efficiently. And guess what? Finance signed off on it. So they told us it was okay. And so that's a fantastic way to kind of bridge that gap between the two.
Well, that leads me to another question that's related. I think for a lot of us in fundraising, a lot of us feel really put upon with a lot of things to do. And there's not enough hands rowing at the oar. And we need more people. We need more staffing. If I'm going to make the case to my fiscal officer that I need more help, obviously it's going to be related to that cost to raise a dollar. But How would you go about making a persuasive case to a fiscal person to put more funding behind fundraising?
I would do that analysis of how much it costs to raise a dollar,
Hmm.
and going a step further and looking at that by, I'll call it like channel, whether
Hmm.
that's major gifts, grants, events, etc., corporate donations. If I reviewed that with my finance person routinely,
Hmm.
and I showed them this is important to me, I have a lot of trust in that team because I know that you're trying to do this efficiently and you just need more resources. To me, that would create a huge amount of trust immediately, just because you're saying, hey, finance, I know you're thinking about the full picture here of how do we get more efficient across the organization. And that's important to me too. And so to me, that just creates trust right out of the gate. And I think if you've got trust and you don't have this adversarial relationship, it makes those discussions, I think, much more of kind of the rubber stamp of like, yeah, maybe not the rubber stamp. Finance always has to dig in and ask questions because that's just what we do.
Yeah,
but
right.
but I think it makes that conversation a lot easier.
I think the things I've struggled with at times is sometimes it's hard to get fiscal types to see fundraisers as a revenue center rather than a cost. And it might be because some of that money is being restricted, right? So it doesn't technically help the bottom line if there's more scholarships. It could potentially, but that's been a challenge for me. But one thing I learned from one leader I served under, because we do like to talk about, well, it costs X, 10 cents to raise a dollar, 20 cents to raise a dollar.
Mm-hmm.
This person flipped it around and went to leadership and said, okay, well, how much do you want to see us raise? And then said, well, okay, so if it's 20 cents to raise a dollar, you need to be prepared to invest, 20% into us to get the 80% growth that you want. And I thought that was a really compelling and a good way to make the argument.
I think it's a perfect way to make the argument. And that's where that analysis and that focus on that, if you can then piggyback on that and say, and 3 years ago when we started this, we were at 35 cents. Now we're at this. That is a powerful 1-2 punch,
Hmm.
in my opinion.
All right, guys, you heard it here. If you want to grow your team, this is what to do. Any other tips or tricks you'd recommend for nonprofit leaders looking to promote harmony between their fiscal people and their fundraising people?
I'll just highlight again one thing I mentioned earlier, and I hate to see it. I hate to see silos because we're a nonprofit because we want to serve, we want to do good, we want to help some population or some cause in this world, right? And so just finding ways to just work together and put that cause, put that mission, that's got to be first. It just has to be first. And if that means, hey, I don't get the funding for this fancy new finance software that I wanted, but that means that development team can go hire, something else, somebody else, or whatever that is. I think it's just finding ways to be willing to kind of go to the back of the line for somebody else in the
Mhm.
organization. Not necessarily, that's maybe not the right answer all the time, but versus trying to always fight for like, I've got to win, I've got to be the first, I've got to get I just, it never works out in my opinion. It just doesn't create great culture. And so finding ways to just keep that mission focused at the organizational level, ultimate goal. Your department's important, but if you're missing the mission of the organization, then nobody's winning. Is how I look at it.
Wow, I can't think of a better note to end on, Stephen. That's some great advice. Thank you so much for being on the show today. Like I said, it's been great to have you on. It's great to just demystify, I think, some of the fiscal world that many of us fundraisers we just don't have the first clue about. So thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate everything you guys do. So we
Now,
wouldn't have organizations without
well, thank
you.
you. Now, let's say I've got some listeners and they're looking for a fractional CFO. How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, I like to point everybody to LinkedIn. My name is Stephen Newland on LinkedIn. I try to post some helpful, simple, practical tips around finance. So it's a great place to go. Or moneypathfpa.com is my That's the best place. If you go on LinkedIn and your executive director or your board DMs me, I'll give them a free financial assessment of their organization and a financial health assessment of their organization. So
that's great. We'll make sure that we include those in the show notes. Thanks again, Stephen, for being on today. Have a great day.
Absolutely. Thanks.
I'm your host, Tom Dauber. Thank you for joining me as we journey together towards major gift mastery on the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast.